I don't need to remind you, but it was nearly 2 weeks ago that the government was claiming there wouldn't be any new questions on the 2026 census about LGBT Australians, despite previously saying there would be new questions about sexuality and transgender and intersex people. It'd create too much nastiness, Jim Chalmers said. But 9 days ago, they backflipped on the backflip and said there would be a question about sexual preferences after all, but there wouldn't be one about transgenderism. We talked about it on the show last week. Well, today, the Treasurer was on ABC's Insiders and he said that the plan was changing again because now there will be a question on gender identity.
Will there be, in the next census, questions on both sexual preference and gender identity?
There will, David. We'll be adding a new topic which covers both sexual orientation and gender. That'll be the first time in the 2026 census. We have listened to the community.
Now, we talked about this last week, and I said last week, Kel, that we should have the question there because I think for the purpose of collecting the data, it is legitimate. But how many times do they want to backflip on the backflip on the backflip on... The plan originally was to have the two questions. Then they said they weren't. Then they said we'll have one and not the other. And now they've got both. Well, all this nonsense that the government's been through, they could have just kept it how it was.
Yeah, well, listen, I'm not a big follower of any code of football, but I recognise an own goal. It is just weird that they are inflicting so much self-inflicted damage. I mean, Peter Dutton just needs to sit there while they punch each other up at the government benches. They're making a mess of it all. They look really bad. I can't see a problem with asking a question. Accurate data is what it's all about. That's just fine. But why get in why treat it as being really important? What they've done is they've dramatised it. They've said, this really matters an awful lot and we're really nervous so we won't do it. Oh no, some people are upset, we will do it. And this one still makes it, oh no, we're not nervous anymore, we'll do this one now. They look like an indecisive government that cannot make decisions, cannot lead,
not the Australian government, Kel. No.
Joe, they've turned something that could have been reasonably uncontroversial into an absolute SHIT show.
Yeah, they did. Look, obviously the usual disclaimer, my wife works for Equality Australia, which has been pushing for this and was the lead among the groups.
We need to get you a cowbell.
Drew it to national attention. I know.
John Laws used to ring the
What I'm trying to say is I'm an ally of the LGBTIQ plus community, whatever the letters there are now. But so it was always going to end in. It was always going to be a problem. You've got a very vocal, a very active group. It's a minority of people, but it is a minority of people for whom this is the most important thing in the world. I mean,
why is it the most important thing?
Because if someone was going around saying to you your whole life that you are a man, and even if you think you're not a man, you are a man, and you have to tell people you're a man, and your documentation has to say you're a man, you would be ropeable. And there are people who simply feel like this is not who they are.
It's just such a Marxist mentality.
It's not.
It really is. It's so Marxist.
There are genuine issues, and there are genuine questions and concerns that need to be raised. We have to make sure that all these procedures and stuff are medically responsible and that we're not misdiagnosing people. But there are, without a shadow of a doubt, and I know them, there are people who absolutely know for sure and knew since they were children that they were born in the wrong gender.
I bet you those ones don't really give a wallop about a lot of this stuff.
The ones I'm thinking of generally...
The ones who are genuine...
They think you have to commit, but the idea that, and they are not the sort of people who say, well, I identify as female, but I still have a penis.
Yeah.
But these are people who have gone all the way with LBJ. But the idea that you would say to those people, oh, no, you're still a man, is pretty appalling.
The whole thing's, like Kel said, an own goal, because if they truly are female or male, then they should just tick that box.
The problem was, so the ABS set up this working group an advisory group to tell it how to do this thing. I'm told, I haven't actually seen the wording, but I'm told that the wording of the questions they came back with was an absolute basket case. I also know for a fact, in my bones through sheer telepathy, that this is not an issue Anthony Albanese wanted to touch with a barge pole during a cost of living crisis, and he's obviously had his fingers burned by The Voice, and people thought that he was out of touch for pursuing that in the middle of an escalating crisis, and he's learned his lesson the hard way with that. And the other thing is that this is, and by the way, the intersex community is still very upset that they will not apparently get a question on the census. So again, you just sort of end
That
up...
makes more sense.
Well,
It makes more sense
maybe
now.
it does, although there would be people filling out the census who may not even know that they were intersex at birth.
Well, I've always been intersex, Joe. But is it, given how much of the public discussion now, Lucy, is taken up by these issues, do we not deserve to get at least a somewhat accurate idea from the census of how many people might identify as transgender or a different gender to the one they were born as?
I'm all for actually collecting the data, and I know that there are many in the gender critical community who are very much against it. I mean, why we need to know what a person's sexual preferences are is a different subject for me altogether, because I personally don't need to know that. But ultimately for me, what this comes down to and why I'm so confused by all of this is that all we've heard for years is that trans men are men, trans women are women. If there is a box that says female and a box that says male, won't they be actually selecting the gender of which they identify with and which many have gone to the trouble of having reflected in their legal documents anyway? What they're effectively saying, just from my perception and looking at it, Joe, is that, no, actually, I'm not a man or I'm not a woman. The identity that I'm identifying myself into, I am transgender. So you're effectively admitting that you aren't that actual gender in the first place. I'm very confused.
So you should be very happy. This is what you've been saying the whole time.
No, but exactly. But all it does is validate that particular argument, Joe. So I'm just, what I'm wanting to say is that I'm confused by it. I'm not against transgender people wishing to live the life that they have chosen to live. But what I am against is it being reflected in the law, which has a host of issues with it, and it opens up, let me finish, it opens up a portal way for people like sexual predators and pedophiles to self-identify so that they can enter women's only spaces.
Obviously, you know, if and where that is happening, that has to be absolutely crushed, and we have to make sure that's not a loophole that's being exploited. I think that would be a tiny,
but the law allows for it.
I think that would be a tiny,
You're not even allowed to
tiny amount of cases, and there are plenty of pedophiles exploiting plenty of institutions and plenty of loopholes already without having to pretend to be a different gender.
This just makes it even easier.
Again, I don't know if it does actually make it easier. There are plenty of men who identify as men who, through boarding schools and government institutions and religious institutions, have been able to grant themselves limitless access to vulnerable people without ever having to pretend that they're a woman.
But you're also saying that the women who are in these vulnerable spaces, like a rape crisis shelter, who's triggered by the presence of a male who says, I don't want to have biological men in my space, they're being told that they don't matter,
I think obviously you have to make sure that in situations like that, that there is a safe space for women who...
But there isn't anymore, Joe. This is the point. In 2013, when the biggest fraud for feminism, Julia Gillard, allowed for the Sex Discrimination Act to be changed and amended from biological sex to allow for gender identity, the laws don't protect women anymore. We saw what happened between Tickle v Giggle.
Of course we have to say that if someone is deliberately trying to exploit these to get access to vulnerable people, be it children or vulnerable women or whatever, obviously we have to stop that from happening.
But you can't even get to that point.
So you're saying that Carlotta or Catherine McGregor shouldn't be able to use a female bathroom?
Who's Carlotta?
Carlotta is the most famous transsexual woman in all of Australian history.
We've lost the point.
Catherine McGregor is a host on Sky News.
But I think the point. Excuse me, if I may take the floor back,
they have to use male toilets.
If I may take the floor back for a second, I think this proves the point about why
you can't just take the floor back because it's an uncomfortable question that you now actually have to face an actual, real-life, tangible...
No, I can take the floor back because it's my program.
That's one person, exactly, like the person who is doing dodgy things.
But this is why we deserve to have data around how many people are identifying as transgender or otherwise. It tells us how big of an issue this actually is. I think that's why the question should be there, and it always should have been in the first place. And the government has opened up a can of worms it didn't need to by going down this road.